In our previous video, we looked at the market failure of prices being too high. And for that, our solution was to set a price ceiling or a maximum price because the market price was seen as unacceptable. Now what we want to look at is what happens when prices are too low. And the solution to that is a price floor. So when we look at a price floor is a minimum price. The price is not allowed to go below it. So to look at an example of when a price floor might be necessary, let's look at the supply and demand for workers. So the demand for workers comes from the business looking to hire people, and the supply of workers comes from households looking for jobs. The market price, based on the supply and demand, is the wage, the hourly wage. Now on this graph, the market wage is about $6.50 here. For unskilled labor, for workers who don't have any education or work experience, the market wage is somewhere between $7 and $10. Now, the question is can you live off of, on this graph, $6.50 or in real life $7 to $10 an hour? Can you buy your groceries? Can you pay your rent? Well, that wage, that price is seen as socially unacceptable because you can't afford your rent and your food based on that wage. So we set a minimum price. Now, when we're looking at a price floor, a minimum, does it make sense for the minimum price to be, say, up here or down here? Well, let's think through that. Okay, whoops. I seem to be losing pages here. All right, let's try this again. There we go. All right, so let's suppose we set a price floor here at $3. If the wage was set at a minimum of $3, then what would happen is there would be lots of quantity demanded. Businesses would want to hire lots of workers if they were only $3 an hour. But at $3 an hour, people are not willing to work, so the quantity supplied here of workers would be fairly low. So quantity demanded would be considerably more than quantity supplied, and we'd have a shortage of workers. Well, what happens when there's a shortage of anything? When there's a shortage, it pushes the price up, and we end up here at this equilibrium. Well, if we have a minimum price, then the price can go above it. It just can't go below it. So it doesn't make sense to put a price floor below equilibrium because the price would just rise to that equilibrium or market price. So when we talk about where we put price floors, we put price floors above equilibrium because the price in the market is seen as too low. Recall that the price ceiling was put below because the price set by the market was too high. So price floors are used when the market price is too low. We set a minimum price that is above it. Well, the problem is the market doesn't like to not be in equilibrium, and it's constantly trying to get back to equilibrium. So while a price control, like a price floor, fixes the issue of the price, or in this case, the wage being too low, it does create other problems. So let's look at the issue of minimum wage. So here we have the market saying that the wage should be lower, and we're saying you can't live on that wage, so we're going to set a minimum wage that's higher. So right now in Alberta, the minimum wage is $15. The market wage should be somewhere between about $7 and $10. In this graph that I have here, we'll set the minimum wage at $10. You can see the market says it should be about $6.50. I need to update my graph. So what happens? Well, if we set this price floor at $10, we're no longer at equilibrium. Here we have our quantity supplied. Here we have our quantity demanded. The amount of people who are willing to work is more the amount of people that businesses are willing to hire is less. So quantity supplied is more than quantity demanded. We have what? We have a surplus of people willing to work, but we have less jobs available. So one of the downsides to minimum wage is it can create unemployment. In this case, we have a surplus of workers, people who want to work but can't find work. And we can see that on our graph here because the quantity supplied is about 130. The quantity demanded is 80. 130 minus 80. We have a surplus here of 50,000 workers. 50,000 workers who want jobs but can't find them. So a risk with minimum wage is that it can lead to higher unemployment. Now, here's an article. Oh, that's not it. Here's an article. When Rachel Notley was Premier of Alberta, so this is 2016, there was an increase in minimum wage. So the argument whenever provincial or state governments raise minimum wage is that it's not going to lead to job loss. It's not going to cause this unemployment that we see here. Now, there's been studies that have been done that have shown that some incremental increases in minimum wage don't lead to job loss and others do. If you are one of the individuals who still gets a job, then you're better off because you're being paid more per hour. But there is this risk that there's a surplus of workers, and at a higher wage, businesses can't afford to pay as many people. Now, there have been a number of cases where they've raised minimum wage and there has not been a change in unemployment. So how is that possible? Or how can Notley argue in this article here that it's not going to lead to the unemployment we see on the graph? Well, if this is the demand for workers and this is the supply of workers, if there is an increase in demand for workers, so we can get businesses to grow and expand and hire more people, then that would cause wages to go up. So here, if you set your price floor here, and you can get demand to increase because you can get businesses to grow and hire more workers, then you're no longer dealing with being in that surplus of workers that we see here. Instead, you're back at equilibrium. And if we're at equilibrium, there's no shortage or surplus, and we don't have the additional unemployment. So if we can get our workers to be more productive, if we can get our businesses to grow and expand, then that price floor of minimum wage doesn't have as big of an impact on unemployment because that price floor is occurring at equilibrium. But if we're not at equilibrium, like we see in this graph, then here we have unemployment. There are other challenges that exist with price floors, and let's look at the example of wheat. So if we go and look at wheat prices, so here you can see the historic prices of wheat. Right here, you see right down here, right at the edge of where my picture is, you can see that 1968-69, look how low the price is for a bushel of wheat, under $2. So the problem is that the price of wheat had fallen so low that it wasn't profitable for people to farm wheat. And we consider farming for essentials like wheat an essential service because we don't want to be dependent on other countries to provide us the basic food necessities. We want to make sure we're producing those in-house. So we need to make sure that people who farm wheat can stay employed doing such. So we need to make sure they can make a living at it, they can make enough profit at it to continue doing so. So what happened is the price of wheat had fallen quite low, And so Canada entered into the International Grain Agreement. Let's just write some of this out. So International Grain Agreement. And we were a member of many countries. Canada, US, France, Australia, Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Hungary. A lot of the world's wheat producers all bandied together to set this price floor. Demand, supply, price in the market had fallen considerably. It was about $1.25 just prior to the price floor being implemented. They set a price floor at $1.75 a bushel. Okay, well, what happens when we institute this price floor? Well, here's quantity supplied. Here's quantity demanded. More people want to farm wheat if it's a higher price, so quantity supplied has gone up. Less people can afford to buy wheat, the more expensive it is, so quantity demanded goes down. Globally, this surplus that you see here was 1 billion bushels of wheat. Well, what do you do with all this extra wheat? The problem is that as long as this wheat is around, it keeps putting downward pressure on the price, right? Because there's a surplus, all this extra wheat. And what do you do when you can't get rid of stuff? You put it on sale and it makes the price fall. So as long as this extra billion bushels of wheat existed, it's putting downward pressure on the price. So what do we do about it? We need to get rid of this surplus. We can't have it sitting in the market. So what did we do in Canada? Well, one thing we did is we paid farmers to take their wheat, put it in a silo, and set it on fire. Okay, so if we burn it, if we get rid of it, then there is not this extra wheat putting downward pressure on the price. We paid farmers to destroy it. The other thing we did is what we call dumping. Dumping is when you sell below cost in another market. So we had all this wheat that was putting downward pressure in the price. And remember, this is an experience by Canada and the US and France and Australia and the Soviet Union and many of the big producers of grain. So we need to get rid of it. We need to get it out of this market so it stops putting downward pressure on the price. So what we did in Canada and a number of other countries is we took this excess wheat and we sold it in Africa. And we sold it cheap. How benevolent of us, right? Providing cheap grain to those who are less fortunate, providing food to others. Well, there's a reason that today dumping is against the law. So when we took that wheat and we then started to sell it below cost in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, what did it do to their grain market? Well, South Africa, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, they all produced wheat. Can you compete as a wheat farmer if all of this foreign wheat is coming in below cost? You can't compete with that. In fact, Zimbabwe no longer produces wheat because of this dumping that happened in the early 70s. So we actually today in Canada have laws against dumping. We don't want other countries to sell below cost in our market, destroying our producers who can't compete. Okay, so we have laws that ban it. In fact, we've been having some challenges over the last decade or so with honey. Honey has been appearing in the US and Canadian market for super cheap. And so Texas A&M University, they actually took some of this honey that was showing up so cheap and DNA tested it to figure out where it was coming from. It turns out this honey was coming from China. And what China was doing is they were funneling the honey through a number of wholesalers and exporters in Germany and other countries to disguise where it was coming from, and then putting it in the North American market. Well, the problem is that our honey producers in the US and Canada couldn't keep up with these prices that this honey was able to sell at. And so we have laws against dumping in the US and Canada, and since then have actually charged the distributor in Germany as well as China with dumping here in North America, selling below cost in another market, in our market. So the problem with these price floors is they create a surplus. And if you don't get rid of the surplus, it's going to put downward pressure on your price. And so price floors can lead to dumping, selling below cost in another market to get rid of it. And those domestic markets that you're dumping your product in, they don't like it because you're destroying their own production. So when we look at price floors, it creates a surplus. If we're talking about workers, the downside is unemployment. If we're talking about other products, we can see dumping or having to pay our producers to destroy product to prevent that downward pressure on price.